I remember the sting more than the sound. The sound came first, a sharp crack of skin on skin, but it was the burn in my cheek that told me I wasn't dreaming. My own daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen, her hands still raised, her face twisted with fury. The words that followed I will never forget. "Then find the money yourself, Margaret, or don't bother showing your face at the wedding anniversary." Her voice was loud enough to rattle the dishes in the cabinet. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. I had said no. That was my crime. No, I would not pay $36,000 for a luxury cruise she wanted to take to celebrate their anniversary. No, I would not dip into my savings, the money I had worked decades to build, just because she thought my retirement fund was her personal piggy bank. She'd started the day with smiles and faux sweetness. "Oh, Margaret, you'd love this cruise too. But of course we know you don't like traveling. So maybe you could just help us with the cost." Her tone was light, but her eyes were already calculating. I said no. Firm, polite, no. Her husband, my son, wasn't home. It was just the two of us. And that's when she exploded. The accusations flew first, how I never supported them enough, how I didn't understand modern marriage, how I was selfish. Then the slap. I didn't see it coming. I didn't even know people actually did that outside of movies. I tasted metal in my mouth. My hand went to my face. I wanted to shout to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared at her, letting the silence fill the air, until she turned on her heel and stormed out, muttering something about talking to Daniel about this. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry, not yet. I was empty. And in that emptiness, something shifted. Let me know where you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this story speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Don't skip, because what happens at the end will surprise you more than the betrayal itself. The next morning, the phone rang. It was Daniel, my son. His voice was tense, rehearsed. "Mom, we need to talk about what happened." Emily told me everything I thought. Whose version of everything I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I told him I needed time to think and hung up before he could argue. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a slap. It was about years, maybe decades of small, subtle shifts I hadn't wanted to see. When my husband died, Daniel was just 17. I had worked 2 jobs to keep the house to pay for his college to make sure he had every opportunity his father would have wanted for him. I never asked for help, never leaned on anyone. I told myself that one day my sacrifices would come back to me in the form of love and respect from my son's family. But respect had left this house a long time ago. I thought about the way Emily had slowly inserted herself into every decision Daniel made. How she had once forgotten to invite me to Christmas dinner with her parents, claiming she thought I wouldn't enjoy it. The time she had sold some of my late husband's tools during a garage sale without asking me because they were cluttering up the garage. I remembered the first time she asked me for money. It was small then, just a couple hundred for a short-term emergency. I gave it, of course. Then a few months later, it was $1,000 for a business idea she never mentioned again. The amounts grew, and my excuses to say no grew thinner. Until today. I didn't know it then, but that slap was the last thing she would ever take from me without permission. After she left, I walked through the house, touching the furniture, the photos on the wall, the quilt my mother had made me when I was a girl. I thought about what this house had seen: birthdays, anniversaries, laughter in the kitchen, tears in the hallway, and I thought about how I was letting someone turn it into a place of tension and fear. No more. I made a pot of tea and sat down with a notebook. My hand shook at first, but I began to write. Names, dates, amounts. Every conversation I could remember about money, about decisions, about slights that I had swallowed. I didn't know why yet, only that I needed to have it all in one place. By the time the sun went down, I had filled 12 pages. Daniel called again that night. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short, almost cold. Mom Emily's upset. I just think it's best if you apologize and we move past this. It's not worth holding on to. Apologize. I sat there holding the phone, listening to that one word echo in my mind. Apologize for what? For saying no? For protecting the money I had earned with my own hands? For not bowing to her every demand? It was then that I knew, truly knew, that I had been living in a quiet kind of captivity, and the only person who could free me was me. When I finally went to bed, I didn't sleep much. My cheek was still tender, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face smug, certain she had the upper hand. That certainty would not last. Before Emily, before cruises and ultimatums, there was a smaller life. Not a lesser one, just tighter. Tucked in corners, hand-washed dishes, and nights that ended with the TV humming softly until I turned it off. I grew up in a house where nothing was wasted and everything was used twice. My mother saved bread bags, and my father saved screws in baby food jars. That was the rhythm I knew. When I married Michael, I didn't expect luxury. I expected a partner for small joys. Coffee on the back steps, grocery lists written on envelopes, a laugh in the middle of a hard day. We weren't perfect, but we didn't need to be. We fit into each other's lives like the last two pieces of a jigsaw. Daniel arrived later than we thought he would. I remember the quiet he brought into the room when the nurse placed him in my arms. It wasn't silence, it was a slowing. I looked at his face, and for the first time, the world didn't ask anything from me. It just waited with me. Michael cried, which I loved him more for. He cried, and then he cut the cord and he whispered, "We'll do right by him, Maggie." We tried. We really did. Money wasn't a river. It was a leaky faucet you coaxed every month. Michael worked at the mill. I worked part-time at the library, then full-time when Daniel started school. We patched our way through. No one knew the thrill of a $20 bill left in last year's coat pocket like we did, but we kept our promises. Daniel always had shoes that fit and birthday cakes that were homemade but special. Pirate ships one year, a baseball diamond the next. I could frost anything if you gave me enough time and a few toothpicks. My marriage was built on simple truths. Michael never missed a night reading to Daniel. He never left a project half done. He never let a paycheck be a mystery. We talked about every dollar. We planned our future in notes taped to the fridge, a second-hand minivan, a small renovation for the kitchen, a week at a lakeside cabin if we could save enough. When he died, heart attack quick unfair, at 48.5, those notes were still stuck under a magnet shaped like a strawberry. The day after the funeral, I pulled them down. I didn't throw them away. I folded them and put them in a shoebox with his tools list and his watch that didn't tick anymore. Grief is a job no one hires you for. It takes all your hours and pays nothing. I woke at 5, cried in the shower, and left for the first job. Bank clerk mornings, school cafeteria afternoons, nights home with Daniel and the homework and the dinners stretched from leftovers. He didn't make it hard. He was a good boy, smart, helpful. He could cut coupons faster than me and knew the taste of generics versus brand names by 12. If I was proud, it wasn't because he was perfect. It was because he tried. He saw the gaps and stepped into them without being asked. We made it through the years by keeping our lane. I didn't date. I didn't go out. I kept the house. I learned how to fix the leaky sink and patch drywall. I sold Michael's old fishing boat and I cried on the drive home afterward, but I cashed the check. On Fridays, Daniel and I had a tradition. Frozen pizza, half a movie, then bed. He asked me once if I missed Dad's laugh. I told him yes every day, and then I told him something else. We miss him by doing what he would have done. We stand where he would have stood. That became our compass. When Daniel got a scholarship, I stood at the kitchen window and let the tears come. Not because we were saved, but because he would leave. That's the way love works. You spend 18 years making a person brave enough to walk away from you. We packed his things in boxes we'd kept from the appliance store. I tucked a roll of quarters in his sock drawer and a photo of Michael in his notebook. On the drive to campus, I said very little. I didn't want my voice to shake. He hugged me 3 times before he waved. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store and walked the aisles without buying anything. The house felt too big that night. I slept on the couch with the TV on and woke up at 3 to turn off a cooking show that had kept me company without asking for a thing. Those were good years, though. Quiet. Me and my routines. I took extra shifts and put money aside. Not a fortune, enough to feel the floor under my feet. I paid off the house slowly. I learned how to say no to myself when I wanted something pretty I didn't need. Every no was a yes to the life I was trying to protect. When Daniel called, I listened more than I spoke. I didn't give advice unless asked. My mother taught me that the surest way to keep a child close is to make your advice rare and careful. Then came Emily. The first time I met her, she brought flowers she couldn't name and a bottle of wine someone else had recommended. She had a smile that held. She was loud in a way that felt like confidence. Daniel was smitten. I stood back and watched. I have learned that the first version of a person is the sales pitch. The second version is the product. For a while, the product matched the pitch. She was sweet with me. She asked about Michael. She asked about the recipes I made. She wore perfume that smelled like pears and summer. I wanted to like her. I tried. At their engagement dinner, she took a call at the table. She laughed too loudly at something on the other end, tossed her hair, and returned without saying who it was. It was nothing, I told myself. Young people are tangled with their phones. Daniel paid for the meal with a credit card I knew had to be straining. After they left, I tucked 2 20s into his coat pocket while he got the car. Old habits don't die, they just find new ways to work. The wedding was pretty and expensive. I baked the groom's cake to save them money. I watched Emily's mother tell the caterer to add more shrimp to the platters because these people eat. I watched the florist touch up a bouquet with pins and tape while the photographer called for another angle. It was a machine. Everyone did their job. I smiled when it was my turn. I held my breath the rest of the time. When they left for their honeymoon, I cleaned the reception hall until midnight with 2 volunteers from the venue. One of them gave me a leftover centerpiece. I drove home with roses in the passenger seat and felt like I had borrowed a life that wasn't mine. After the wedding, the calls changed. Daniel's voice had an echo to it like someone else stood nearby while we talked. Emily started to answer his phone when I called. She was polite. Too polite. When she said my name, it sounded rehearsed. The first money request came when their car needed brakes. Just a loan, Daniel said. We'll pay you back. I said yes because it was safety and I didn't want him on the highway with bad brakes. They didn't pay it back. I didn't ask. I kept my small life in place. My job at the library became part-time again. I did inventory like a meditation. I created a separate account years ago, a slow-growing fund from careful choices, and one lucky investment a coworker had tipped me to long ago. I didn't advertise it. It wasn't a secret for secrecy's sake. It was a boundary. My name, my effort, my future. If I learned anything from losing a husband young, it was that a woman should never walk into the unknown without a folded map in her pocket. Emily came to my house more after they started thinking about a child. She made a show of asking for recipes and family stories. She flipped through photo albums but never looked long. She liked the idea of history more than the work of it. One afternoon, she asked about the house. Do you ever think about moving into a condo, less maintenance, more amenities? I smiled and said I liked my porch and my garden. She smiled back and said, of course, in a tone that sounded like we had agreed on something we hadn't discussed. There were good days. I'm not going to rewrite history to fit the ending. There were Sundays when we ate roast chicken, and Emily brought a side dish she'd found online. There were birthdays with candles and a slightly off-key happy birthday that made us laugh. There were moments when she touched my arm and asked sincerely about my health. I let those moments count. I put them in the same shoebox where I kept Michael's notes. People are not one thing. I wanted that to be true of her. Still, something subtle shifted over time. It was in the way she appraised rooms, in the way her eyes moved over objects with a little calculation. It was in the conversations that took a turn toward what other people owed her. Bad bosses, unfair friends, always someone else's fault. She had a talent for telling a story where she was the hero, and if not the hero, then the underpaid extra. It wasn't criminal. It was a posture. It was a way of standing in a room that took up more space than it gave back. When Daniel got his promotion, we celebrated. I gave him a watch not expensive, but solid. Emily mentioned a trip she wanted them to take to mark the moment. Her eyes flicked to me when she said it. I felt the old tension in my jaw. I said nothing. I cleaned the plates and put the kettle on. That night after they left, I took out my ledger. I still kept it old-fashioned as it was. Not because I didn't trust banks, because I trusted paper. Every major expense, every gift, every date. It wasn't a weapon. It was a diary written in numbers. I think now about those years as a bank of warmth I kept depositing into. Love, time, meals, rides, attention. The balance grew. I believed we all saw it. I believed it would be honored. That's the trick of family. You think the ledger is shared? It isn't. It's personal. Some people keep theirs in ink. Some keep it in pencil. Some pretend there isn't one at all until they want something. Even then, I didn't expect the slap. I didn't expect the words. I didn't expect to be told to fund a life that wasn't mine as if it were a fee for membership. I didn't expect the day I told her no would be the day the past rose up like a witness. But that's what happened. Every sacrifice, every quiet choice, every night I counted pennies and made them into safety, those things stood up for me when my voice felt small. That is what I came back to. Not anger, not revenge. A simple memory of who I had been and who I still was under all the noise. A woman who learned early to stand where he would have stood. A woman who could say no without apology because the yes had been my entire life. That's what I wanted you to know before the rest unfolds. I didn't come to this as a bitter stranger. I came to it as a mother who once had a good marriage, a hard loss, and a son she raised with open hands. I came to it with a house paid for slowly, a ledger filled patiently, and a heart that believed in fairness. What came next didn't erase what came before. It only put it in sharper focus. It made the love real. It made the sacrifices visible, and it gave me the backbone to do what I had to do when the temperature in my own kitchen changed and the world asked me to pay a bill I never owed. It began so quietly I almost didn't notice. That's the thing about betrayal, it doesn't show up in a storm. It slips in with the rain and pretends it was always there. After the slap, when I started looking back, I could see the trail she'd been leaving for years. But at the time, it just felt like life shifting, like relationships changing as people grow older. The first real crack was over Thanksgiving. It was the year Daniel and Emily decided to host at their place. I'd been looking forward to it, new traditions, I thought. The night before, Emily called and said, "Oh, Margaret, you don't need to bring anything. We've got it all handled." I took it as kindness, but when I arrived, the first words out of her mouth were, "Oh, you didn't bring the pie." She said it lightly, but the way her eyebrows lifted made me feel like I'd failed some unspoken test. I laughed it off, told her I thought she'd said not to bring anything. She waved it away, but she didn't sit next to me once that night. Daniel was still Daniel in those early days, hugging me at the door, making sure I had a good seat, refilling my glass without me asking. But even then I noticed his attention seemed split. He'd glance at Emily before answering me, like he was checking his lines in a play. If she nodded, he spoke freely. If she didn't, he'd change the subject. Christmas that year was worse. She insisted they host again, but smaller, she said, just them, me, and a couple of her friends. I agreed, even brought a gift for each guest. When I arrived, I found out her parents were there too. No one told me. Her mother greeted me with a kind smile, but I couldn't help feeling like a visitor in a space where I used to belong. The requests for money started slipping in around then, too. Always for something sensible: breaks, dental work, a surprise bill from the vet. I gave what I could without damaging my own plans. I didn't keep a running total, but I noticed Emily never thanked me directly. It was always through Daniel. Emily says thanks, or that really helped Emily out. She kept herself 1 degree removed from gratitude. I started to hear little comments from mutual acquaintances. Emily said you were thinking about downsizing. Emily mentioned you were getting lonely in that big house. They weren't lies exactly, but they weren't my words either. She was building a version of me in other people's minds, one where I was fragile, maybe even a little needy. I didn't correct it. At the time, I thought ignoring it would make it fade. By the second year of their marriage, invitations to family events came less and less often. I'd get a group text instead of a phone call, or I'd find out about a gathering from a photo posted online. Once I drove past a restaurant in town and saw Daniel's car parked outside with her parents. I waited for him to mention it later. He never did. One of the clearest signs came on my birthday. Daniel called in the morning, cheerful, said they'd stop by after dinner. I made a cake. I even put out the good plates. They never came. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "So sorry, Margaret, we got caught up. Let's do it next week." No mention of the cake. No apology from Daniel. Just a polite, distant sentence like she was canceling a hair appointment. I began to shrink my expectations. That's what happens when the people you love start rearranging the furniture of your relationship. You stop trying to sit in the same chairs. I told myself Daniel was busy, that Emily had her own way of showing care, that maybe I was being sensitive. But deep down I knew the center of the relationship had shifted. I wasn't the anchor anymore. I wasn't even part of the map they navigated by. One night I stayed up late going through old photo albums. Not the digital ones, real ones with smudged corners and captions written in Michael's careful print. I found a picture of Daniel on his first day of high school, standing by the front steps with a backpack too big for him. I remembered the pride in his smile, the way he'd let me fix his collar, even though he was already taller than me. That boy wouldn't have let months go by without a real conversation. That boy would have noticed if I'd stopped laughing as much. When I started paying closer attention, I realized Emily had a pattern. She'd alternate warmth and distance like a thermostat she controlled. One week she'd drop by with muffins she'd accidentally made too many of sitting at my kitchen table asking about my garden. The next week, she'd go silent, no calls, no replies, no invitations. Then when she reappeared, she'd mention some expense that had been such a strain. It was as if the warmth was bait, and the absence made me eager for her return, and more likely to give. It worked for a while. I told myself it was generosity, that family helped family. But a part of me knew I was paying for access, not need. And every time I said yes, it felt like I was buying my own place in my son's life. The final nudge before everything truly broke came 2 months before the slap. Emily and Daniel came over for dinner. We'd finished eating, and Emily leaned back in her chair, casual as could be, and said, "You know, Margaret, you should think about adding Daniel to your accounts. Just in case something happens. It would make things so much easier." She said it like she was talking about changing light bulbs. Daniel didn't say a word. He just looked at his plate. I smiled because smiling is what you do when someone says something shocking in your own dining room. "That's not something I'm ready to do," I said lightly, like we were still playing nice. Emily shrugged, but her eyes cooled. It was after that dinner that I decided to watch more closely, to keep my own counsel, and to stop thinking of Emily's behavior as quirks or misunderstandings. She wasn't careless with me. She was careful. Careful in ways that made sure the balance of power stayed with her. The slap when it came wasn't the first hit. It was just the first one anyone could hear. After the cruise fight, after the slap, after the phone calls that felt more like ultimatums than conversations, I stopped pushing. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain my side to Daniel anymore. I'd learned something in those first raw days. People don't hear you when they've already decided what you are. And Emily had decided I was selfish, controlling, and in her way. No amount of defense on my part was going to rewrite the script she was feeding him. So I went quiet. Not silent in the bitter slamming doorway, silent in the deliberate way. I answered questions simply. I didn't offer extras. I listened more than I spoke. I let her talk even when the comments were sharp enough to nick skin. In that stillness, I began to notice everything. When they visited, Emily would scan my living room first, her eyes pausing on certain pieces, the grandfather clock Michael's father had built, the china cabinet from my mother. She'd run her hand over the table like she was taking inventory. If I left the room, I could hear faint murmurs, but the tone was wrong for casual conversation. Too quick, too low. I didn't strain to catch words. I didn't need to. Tone tells you almost everything. Daniel seemed more tired around me. Not physically, he looked healthy enough, but worn in a way that came from too many conversations behind closed doors. He'd start to tell me something about work, about a new project, or a problem with a colleague, and then Emily would redirect. "Oh, tell Mom about the trip we're planning, or didn't you say you wanted to show her that picture from the restaurant?" He'd follow her lead like a man used to walking on a narrow path. I started writing things down, not accusations, observations, dates when she'd brought up money, exact words she'd used when she hinted about my will, how Daniel's mood shifted before and after they talked privately in my kitchen. I kept these notes in the same ledger I used for my finances. If you'd opened it without knowing, you might have thought they were just numbers. But I knew which ones were memories disguised as math. I also started listening differently. I'd always been a good listener, but now I listened for the spaces between words, the details people accidentally gave away when they were trying to hide something. Once Emily mentioned that their accounts were all tangled up, and she wished she had access to more liquid funds. She said it while pretending to check a text, her tone light like she was just chatting, but it wasn't casual. It was a fishing line cast in my direction. Another time she came by alone, rare for her, and commented on how much she loved my backyard. If this were my place, she said I'd put in a hot tub right there. She pointed to the corner near the lilac bushes. You've got the space and the privacy. She said it like she was dreaming aloud, but I saw the way she glanced at the back door as if imagining herself walking out onto my deck with a drink in hand. The more I observed, the less I reacted. If she made a jab, I guess some people just don't like to splurge on family, I'd smile faintly and change the subject. If she asked about my savings, I'd say I'm comfortable and nothing more. The fewer details I gave, the more she tried to fill the silence with her own assumptions. That was useful. People who talk too much when they're fishing for information often give away what they're really after. It was around this time I realized Emily thought I was weak. She took my quiet for passivity, my politeness for submission. That was fine. I wanted her to think that. I wanted her to believe she'd won whatever fight she thought we were having. Meanwhile, I was learning her rhythms. How she'd often ask for something small, help with a recipe, a ride to a store before leading into a bigger request. How she'd frame her demands as if they were ideas I'd already agreed to. Remember how you said you'd help with our trip, she asked, once weeks after I'd said no such thing. I didn't correct her. I just said I'd have to think about it. Daniel, for his part, seemed to float between us, trying to keep the peace. But peace was never the goal for Emily. Control was. And peace can't survive in a house where control is the only currency. In the evenings after they left, I'd sit in my armchair with a cup of tea and read over my notes. Patterns emerged like ink in water. Times when she'd bring up my house's value always followed a lunch with her real estate friend. Days she hinted about my will often came after she'd been to see her mother. I started to suspect I wasn't just part of her plans, I was a project. I also thought about Daniel more in those days, about the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. I didn't blame him for loving her. We can't always see the strings attached to the people we fall for. But I did wonder how much of him was still his own and how much had been quietly rewired to match her needs. The old me before the slap might have tried to rescue him, might have sat him down and laid out every concern, every detail I'd collected. But the woman I was becoming knew better. Timing mattered more than truth. If I confronted him too soon, he'd defend her and resent me. If I waited, if I let her keep pulling the rope tighter one day, he might feel the choke himself. So I waited. I listened. And I prepared. Because my silence wasn't surrender. It was the space where I built the plan that would change everything. People mistake stillness for absence. They think if you're not reacting, you're not doing anything. But there's a difference between doing nothing and doing it quietly. After the slap, I learned to move without making noise. My plan started with 3 simple truths. 1, Emily wanted my money. 2, she thought Daniel would inherit everything when I died. 3, she assumed she'd control whatever Daniel got. If she believed those things, I could use them. The first step was making an appointment with someone I trusted more than almost anyone, Victor, my late husband's cousin, and a retired attorney. I didn't tell Daniel I was going. I didn't even drive my own car. I borrowed my friend Marlene's hatchback so Emily wouldn't see mine parked outside Victor's office. Victor listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk, eyes narrowed the way they always did when he was working through a puzzle. When I finished, he said, "You're right not to confront her directly. That's what she's expecting. You'll get farther if she doesn't see you moving." We went through my finances, every account, every property record. He explained how I could set up a living trust that would bypass probate, entirely naming Daniel as beneficiary under very specific terms. Terms that meant Emily would never touch a penny if she stayed married to him. If they divorced, that would be different. But while they were together, she'd be locked out. I signed the paperwork within 2 weeks. My house, my savings. Even the life insurance policy from Michael's old job, all of it went into the trust. Daniel wouldn't know until after I died, and Emily would never know unless she tried to get her hands on something before then. The second step was more personal. I started moving small valuables, my mother's jewelry, Michael's watch, the antique coins my father had given me, into a safety deposit box at the bank. Not the one where I kept my checking account, but a small branch out of town where no one knew me. I left decoy pieces in my jewelry box, things I wouldn't miss. I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. The third step was observation with a purpose. Before, I'd taken notes to help me remember. Now I was building a timeline. If I ever needed to prove manipulation, I'd have it documented. Dates of requests, exact words, and Daniel's reactions. I even noted when Emily seemed extra sweet to me, because those days almost always preceded an ask. It wasn't all legal maneuvering. Some of it was psychological. I started agreeing with her more often, not on big things, but on small meaningless topics. Yes, that paint color would look good in the dining room. You're right, these muffins are better with almond extract. It lowered her guard. She started treating me like a resource again, someone she could shape. That's what I wanted. Because while she was watching me, I was watching her lose patience. One Saturday, she came by with Daniel to help me clear out the garage. I'd already removed anything of value, but I played along. She made a pile of my things. She thought I should donate 2 old chairs, some gardening tools, a box of books. "You're not really using these, are you?" she asked, her tone all innocence. I smiled. "You're right. Why don't you take them?" Her eyes lit up. She loaded them into their SUV without hesitation. It wasn't about the objects, it was about showing her I could be generous without it costing me anything I wasn't willing to lose. The turning point came a month later. They invited me to brunch at a cafe downtown. Over coffee, Emily leaned in, her voice low. "We've been thinking, Margaret, you could come on the cruise with us. If you helped cover it, we'd make it a family trip. Memories, you know." I looked at Daniel, not Emily. "That's generous of you," I said. "But I don't think a cruise is for me. You two go and enjoy yourselves." Her smile tightened. She wasn't used to me refusing twice. That was when I knew I had the upper hand, not because she couldn't get what she wanted, but because she didn't even realize I'd already made sure she never would. Still, I wanted to see how far she'd push. And to do that, I had to give her the illusion of winning. So I started mentioning small projects. I was considering a bathroom remodel, a landscaping upgrade, knowing she'd see dollar signs. Each time I'd change the subject before giving any details. She took the bait. Soon she was dropping hints about helping me pick out finishes or finding the best contractors. Every suggestion was another line in my notes. Meanwhile, Daniel remained caught in the middle. I could see the tension in him when I'd say no to her requests. He'd rub the back of his neck, look away. Once, when Emily left the room, he said quietly, "She means well, Mom. She just wants us all to be closer." Closer. That was one word for it. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him about the trust or the safety deposit box or the decoys in my jewelry case. Some truths work better as silent shields than as spoken warnings. By the time spring came, I'd set the stage. My assets were protected, my valuables secured, my records meticulous. All that was left was to wait for the moment she overplayed her hand. And she would. People like Emily always do. The slap had been the spark. The months since had been the kindling. And when she lit the match because she would, I'd be ready to watch the fire burn without it touching me. The first slip came in April. Not a big one, just a detail she didn't mean to give away. We were having coffee in my kitchen, a rare visit without Daniel. She'd been unusually chatty, telling me about a dinner party they'd gone to the week before. Somewhere between the salad and dessert, she said, "Oh, we didn't even have to pay for the wine. Daniel put it on his work card." She stopped mid-sentence. I saw the moment she realized she'd said too much. Daniel's company was strict about expenses. If they found out he was using his corporate card for personal purchases, there would be consequences. She quickly changed the subject to a recipe she wanted to try, but I filed the comment away in my notes the moment she left. The second slip was bigger. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of Daniel's old college friends, Greg. We hadn't spoken in years, but he'd always been polite when we crossed paths. He said he was trying to reach Daniel about repaying a loan. My heart sank. Greg said it wasn't a huge amount, about $3,000, but it had been months, and Daniel wasn't returning his calls. I thanked him for letting me know and hung up. I didn't tell him I had no idea Daniel had borrowed that kind of money or why, but I had a guess, and it wasn't for anything Greg would approve of. Then in early May, Emily came over with a proposal. She and Daniel wanted to consolidate their finances. She said it in that breezy way people use when they're testing a reaction. It's just smarter, she explained. One pool of money, fewer accounts to manage. She even mentioned that they could include me, merge certain bills, make sure things were streamlined for the future. I asked her what she meant by the future. She smiled a slow, knowing thing. "Well, you're not going to be around forever, Margaret. Might as well make sure it's all easy to transfer when the time comes." I didn't flinch. I just nodded and said, "That's something to think about." But I didn't think about it. I acted. I called Victor the next morning and asked him to add another layer to the trust. The language would make it impossible for anyone but Daniel to inherit anything, and only after he'd completed a 6-month financial review by an independent trustee. If he failed, the assets would pass to my niece Claire. It was harsh, but I had to be realistic. Meanwhile, Emily's control was starting to fray around the edges. She'd make snide remarks to Daniel in front of me about how he never thought ahead or forgot things she told him. She seemed more impatient, quicker to snap. Once during a Sunday lunch, she left the table to take a phone call, and Daniel leaned over to me. "Mom," he whispered, "things have been tense. She's just stressed. Don't read too much into it." I wanted to ask him what tense really meant, but I stayed quiet. The more I listened, the more he talked. That day he told me they'd been arguing about money, that she wanted to remodel the kitchen, but he thought they should pay off credit cards first, that she'd been really upset when he didn't get a bigger bonus this year. I knew then that the cracks weren't just between me and Emily. They were between her and Daniel, too. And cracks spread. In June, the third slip happened, and it was the one I'd been waiting for. I was out in the garden when the mail came. Among the usual bills and junk was an envelope addressed to Emily sent to my house. No return address, but the postmark was from a high-end jewelry store downtown. When she came by later that week, I mentioned it casually. "Oh, by the way, a letter came for you here. From Baxter and Holt Jewelers." Her face froze. Just for a second, but long enough. "Oh, that must be about a repair," she said quickly. "I'll get it from you next time." I hadn't opened it, of course. But when she left that afternoon, she never asked for it. A week later, I noticed Daniel wearing a new watch I'd never seen before. It wasn't subtle gold heavy, the kind of thing you don't buy on a whim. The pieces were falling into place. They weren't just careless with money, they were using it in ways that could hurt Daniel's career and their marriage. And Emily, I suspected, was steering most of it. By July, her mask had slipped so far I could see the ambition underneath. She stopped pretending her interest in my finances was casual. "You know, Margaret, you could make things easier on all of us if you just added us to the deed." Now she said one afternoon, straight-faced, as if suggesting I try a new brand of coffee. That was the moment I knew she was going to push until she either got what she wanted or fell apart trying. And I was going to make sure it was the second one. It was August when the confrontation finally came, and it didn't happen the way I'd imagined it in my angrier moments. There was no shouting, no wild accusations. Just me, Daniel, and Emily sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where she'd once slapped me, and the truth laid out like the place settings between us. Daniel had called earlier in the week saying they wanted to clear the air. I agreed, but only because I was ready. I'd been ready for months. I made coffee, set out 3 mugs, and waited for them to arrive. They came together, but not side by side. Emily went straight to the table, her purse on the chair beside her, as if she were claiming territory. Daniel looked tired. Really tired. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled like he'd grabbed it off the back of a chair. I sat across from them, my hands folded. "So I said you wanted to talk," Emily started. "Margaret, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot lately. We're family. We should be working together, not fighting over money." I let her talk. She went on about how families pool resources, how it's silly to keep things separate when the future is coming for all of us. She even threw in a line about how Michael wouldn't have wanted you to be so isolated. That one made my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice even. "Is that what you think this is? Isolation?" She shrugged, eyes darting to Daniel, who said nothing. I reached under the table and pulled out a thin folder. I'd kept it nearby, waiting for the right moment. I set it on the table and slid it toward her. "These are records. Dates, amounts. Conversations we've had over the past 4 years. Emily didn't touch it. "I don't know what you mean." Daniel glanced at the folder, then at me. "Mom, what is this?" "It's everything I said. Every time you've asked for money. Every time Emily's hinted about my will or the house. Every shift in tone. Every piece of pressure. I've kept track." Emily laughed, short, sharp. "You're making it sound like some kind of investigation." "It's exactly that," I said quietly, because I needed to see the pattern for myself. And once I saw it, I acted. Daniel leaned forward. Acted how I met his eyes. "Everything I own is in a living trust. You're the beneficiary, Daniel, but with conditions. If you stay married, Emily will never have access to a cent. If you divorce, that's different. But while you're together, she's locked out." Emily's face went pale, then flushed. "That's..." She stopped herself, glancing at Daniel again. I didn't let her recover. "My valuables are gone from this house. The accounts you think you know about aren't the ones that matter. You've been trying to map a property you'll never own, Emily, and you've been underestimating me since the day we met." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, this is a lot." "Yes," I said. "It is. And I didn't want to do it." But I had to, because you weren't seeing what was happening to you, and I wasn't going to let it happen to me. Emily tried to regain control. You're twisting everything. I've only ever wanted what's best for this family. I leaned back. Then you should be happy, because this ensures my assets stay in the family and safe from misuse. For the first time in a long while, Daniel looked at her without flinching. He didn't speak, but the silence said enough. I stood signaling the conversation was over. There's nothing more to discuss today. You can finish your coffee or you can leave. But my boundaries are set. Emily's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. She muttered something under her breath, grabbed her purse, and walked out without looking back. Daniel stayed seated for another minute, staring at the folder in front of him. Finally, he said, "You didn't trust me enough to tell me before I shook my head. I trusted you too much to make you choose before you were ready." He nodded slowly, then left without taking the folder. When the door closed, I sat back down at the table. My hands were steady. My heart was steady. The confrontation I'd once dreaded had passed, and the walls I'd built were still standing. Daniel didn't call for a week after the kitchen table confrontation. I didn't call him either. I let the silence work. Silence can do what arguments never can. It makes people sit with their own thoughts. On the 8th day, my phone rang. His voice was quiet, careful. "Can I come by?" He showed up an hour later alone. "No, Emily." He looked like he hadn't slept, much shadows under his eyes, a 2-day beard. I put the kettle on and waited for him to speak first. "She's furious," he said finally. "Said you've been plotting against her for years. Said you're trying to break us up." I didn't answer that. I just poured tea into his mug and slid it across the table. "She kept asking why you'd do something like that," he went on. I didn't know what to tell her. Part of me thought, maybe you were overreacting. But part of me... He trailed off, staring into the steam. "What does that part of you think?" I asked. He took a long time before answering. "It thinks you're protecting yourself. And maybe me." I sipped my tea. Both can be true. He rubbed his temples. "She's been different since that day. More impatient. Shorter with me. Like she's keeping score. That didn't surprise me. When control starts to slip, people like Emily don't just let it go. They tighten their grip wherever they can." Over the next few weeks, the pattern became obvious. Daniel would stop by more often, usually alone, saying he happened to be in the neighborhood. He didn't talk much about Emily unless I asked. When he did, it was about fights over money, about her saying she shouldn't have to struggle when there were resources in the family being hoarded. Once he told me she'd brought up the house again, suggesting they could help me sell it before it became too much work. I just shook my head and said, "The house is fine." What I didn't tell him was that Victor had already made sure the deed was ironclad in the trust. The more time passed, the more I noticed the strain in Daniel. He'd lost weight. His laugh when it came was quieter. He seemed to be measuring his words as though someone might correct him at any moment. In late September, I saw Emily at the grocery store. She was at the checkout with a cart full of high-end groceries, imported cheese, premium wine, brand name, everything. She didn't see me. I watched her pull out a credit card, the black kind with the weighty metal feel, and swipe it like the cost didn't matter. I wondered if Daniel knew. By October, I started hearing things from others. My friend Nancy, who works part-time at a boutique downtown, said Emily had been in twice that month, each time buying several items. She said she was celebrating, Nancy told me. Didn't say what for. Celebrating on debt, I thought. Daniel came over one rainy evening, his hair damp, his jacket dripping onto the mat. He sat down heavily and said, "She wants me to ask you for $50,000. I put my mug down slowly. "For what a business?" He said, not meeting my eyes. "Some kind of online store. She says it's the future, that we'll make it back in a year." "And you?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know. It feels risky. But she says I'm not supporting her dreams if I don't try." I leaned forward. "Daniel, you have to decide what's yours and what's hers. What's worth risking and what's worth protecting. Because once it's gone, it's gone." He didn't argue. He just sat there staring at his hands. The next day I called Victor and told him to add one more clause to the trust. If Daniel took any loan or gift from me over a certain amount, it would trigger a review of the trust's terms. I didn't want to cut him off entirely, but I wasn't going to let Emily drain me through him. By November, the distance between them was obvious, even in public. At a family friend's birthday party, Emily sat at one end of the table, Daniel at the other. They barely spoke. When she left early, Daniel stayed behind and nursed a drink in silence. That was when I knew something had shifted. The confrontation hadn't just protected me, it had set something in motion between them. And like any crack in a wall, it was only going to grow. The call came the week before Christmas. Daniel's voice was tense, rushed, like he was talking from somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "Mom, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest." I told him I would. "Is it true he said that you've put everything into a trust so Emily can't touch it?" The question hit me harder than I expected, not because I was caught off guard, but because I knew what it meant. She'd found out. "Yes," I said plainly. "It's true." Silence on the other end. Then she's furious. Says you don't trust her. Says it's insulting. "Daniel." I said this isn't about trust. It's about protection. If anything happened to me, I wanted to be sure what I've built doesn't get lost or misused. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked, "Can I come over tomorrow? I want to see the paperwork for myself." When he arrived, I already had the folder laid out on the table. I walked him through every page, how the trust worked, what it covered, the clauses that kept it out of Emily's reach while they were married. I didn't do this to punish anyone, I told him. I did it so there would still be something left. Your father worked too hard, and I worked too hard to let it vanish in a year, because someone thought it was their right to spend it. Daniel sat there running his hand through his hair. She's going to see this as a declaration of war. I shrugged. Then she's choosing to see it that way. My job is to make sure I'm not defenseless. After he left, I called Victor again. Tighten it even more, I told him. If they divorce, his share stays protected until the divorce is finalized and any joint debts are settled. I don't want her walking away with half of what I've built through the back door. Victor didn't even pause. I'll draft the addendum this afternoon. By New Year's, I started to feel a shift in the air. Emily stopped calling altogether. When Daniel visited, it was always alone. He seemed more relaxed without her there, lighter even, but I could see the lines of worry in his face. "She says I've let you come between us," he told me one afternoon in January, "that I'm supposed to be on her side, not yours." "You're not supposed to be on anyone's side," I said. "You're supposed to be on the side of what's right for you. If that lines up with me, fine. If it doesn't, that's your choice. But don't let anyone tell you loyalty means blind obedience." In February, the first official move came. I received a letter from a law office I didn't recognize. Emily had tried to have Daniel added to the deed on my house, claiming it was part of a family transfer. The lawyer's tone was polite but firm, asking for my consent. I didn't even bother calling Emily. I forwarded the letter to Victor. His reply was short. Already handled. They'll never try that again. Still, it was a warning shot. She wasn't just angry, she was willing to use legal channels to try to get her way. That's when I took the last step. I changed my will. The trust already covered the major assets, but the will was where I could make things very clear. I left personal items to Daniel, to my niece Claire, and to a few close friends. Emily's name didn't appear once, not even as a contingent beneficiary. Victor raised an eyebrow when he read it over. "You want her completely out?" "Yes," I said. "If she gets anything from me, it will only be because Daniel chooses to share it after I'm gone, and that will be his choice, not my mistake." When I signed the documents, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, absolute certainty. The next time Daniel visited, I didn't mention the changes. Some things didn't need to be said yet, but I could tell he knew something had shifted. He looked at me across the table and said, "She's been talking about leaving." I didn't react. "And how do you feel about that?" He stared into his coffee for a long time. "I don't know yet. But I'm starting to think. You've been seeing things I didn't want to see." I didn't say it, but the truth was, I'd been preparing for that moment from the very first time Emily smiled at me and saw a bank account instead of a person. By March, the whispers had started. Not from me, I'd kept my mouth shut, but from the edges of their social circle. People talk, and money trouble makes them talk faster. I'd hear things from neighbors, from friends of friends. Emily had been venting to the wrong people, trying to paint herself as the victim of a controlling mother-in-law. "She says you're freezing her out," my friend Nancy told me over coffee. "That you're sitting on a fortune you refuse to share, even though she and Daniel are struggling." Struggling. I thought about the imported groceries, the boutique clothes, the cruise she still brought up in conversation with anyone who'd listen. It wasn't struggling, it was living beyond their means and calling it normal. The more she talked, the more cracks appeared in her version of events. One of Daniel's old co-workers ran into me at the market. "Sorry if this is awkward," he said, "but Emily mentioned you were thinking of selling your house and moving in with them. That true?" I smiled politely. "No, it's not." He laughed. "Didn't think so. Didn't sound like you. Her lies were getting sloppy. And sloppy lies are dangerous because they don't just fail, they reveal the liar's intent. By April, she was no longer trying to charm me. Every interaction was tight-clipped with a layer of contempt, just thin enough to pass as politeness. At a family friend's barbecue, she handed me a plate like she was delivering paperwork she didn't want to touch. She didn't make eye contact once. Daniel, on the other hand, was showing signs of distance from her. He lingered near me more than usual, joined conversations I was in. When she called to him from across the yard, he didn't jump to answer. It was subtle, but I noticed. Then came the brunch incident. We were seated at a cafe when Emily's friend Marissa joined us unexpectedly. I barely knew her, but Emily acted like we were all old friends. About halfway through the meal, Marissa leaned toward me and said, "Emily tells me you finally decided to loosen the purse strings." "That's great news." I set down my fork. "Did she?" Emily's smile froze. "Oh, she's just teasing Margaret." "No," Marissa said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension. "She said you were thinking about helping with that online store you two have been working on." Daniel's head snapped toward Emily. "What store?" The color drained from her face. "It's nothing, just an idea." "An idea you didn't tell me about?" he asked. The rest of the meal was silent except for the clink of cutlery. That was the moment I knew the story she'd been spinning was starting to unravel in front of the one person she couldn't afford to lose. After that, things escalated quickly. In May, Daniel told me they'd had a blowout fight over finances. She'd accused him of sabotaging her dreams. He'd accused her of lying to him. She left the house for 2 days. When she came back, her tone toward me changed again, but this time it wasn't contempt. It was brittle politeness, the kind people use when they're trying not to break in public. I'd seen it before in others. It's the look of someone who's realizing they might not win after all. Around this time, I started noticing small shifts in the way people treated me socially. Friends who used to stay neutral began quietly taking my side. Invitations from mutual acquaintances came addressed to Margaret and Daniel with no mention of Emily. By June, she'd stopped trying to involve me in anything. She no longer hinted about the house or the will. She barely spoke when we were in the same room. I knew better than to think she'd given up entirely, but I could feel her sphere of influence shrinking. And here's the thing about people like Emily, they don't just fade away. When their world starts closing in, they make noise. They try to claw their way back into relevance, and in doing so, they show you exactly where their weak points are. I didn't know it yet, but she was about to show me hers. The weak point appeared in July, and it came from a direction I didn't expect her family. I was trimming the rose bushes when my phone buzzed. The caller ID read private number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Margaret. This is Helen, Emily's mother. We'd spoken only a handful of times, always politely, never personally. Her voice now was strained as though she were choosing each word carefully. I thought you should know. Emily has been talking to my sister about a loan. A large one. She told her you'd promised to match whatever she borrowed. I stood there pruning shears in hand. I made no such promise. That's what I thought, Helen said quickly. I didn't think it sounded like you, but Emily's been... Well, she's been saying a lot lately, and some of it doesn't add up. I didn't ask why she was telling me this now. I already knew when someone starts spinning too many stories eventually, even their allies start looking for a way to distance themselves. Later that week, Daniel came by. He looked worn down, like he'd been carrying a backpack full of bricks for months. She's been making plans without me, he said quietly. Talking to people about money. Acting like I've agreed to things I've never even heard about. I didn't gloat. I didn't say I told you so, even though the words burned at the back of my throat. I just poured him coffee and let him talk. She doesn't see it as lying. He continued. She says it's just getting the ball rolling. But it's not her ball to roll, Mom. It's my job, my credit, my life. The next part he said without looking at me, I've talked to a lawyer. I sat very still. About what? About divorce. The word hung between us heavier than I expected. I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt something closer to grief, not for Emily, but for the years Daniel had lost believing in something that had been hollow from the start. He didn't go into details. I didn't press him, but I did ask one question. Do you need help? He shook his head. Not right now, but thank you. By August, word had started to spread. Not from me, never from me, but from the ripples of their arguments spilling into public spaces. Emily was overheard in a cafe saying Daniel was choosing his mother over his wife. Daniel was seen leaving a lawyer's office downtown. Mutual friends began quietly unfollowing her on social media. One night Nancy called me after running into Emily at the store. She looked, I don't know, cornered Nancy said, like she was smiling because she didn't know what else to do. The official separation happened in early September. Daniel moved into a small apartment across town. Emily stayed in the house. There was no grand announcement, just a slow trickle of realization among friends and family. When Daniel came to see me after the move, he looked lighter. Not happy, not yet, but relieved in a way that was almost visible. He told me he'd filed for divorce. I don't know what's going to happen with the house or the debts he admitted, but at least now I know what's mine and what's hers. I told him I was proud of him, not for leaving people can stay or go for their own reasons, but for finally seeing the truth clearly. Emily didn't contact me, not once. I suspected she knew there was nothing left to gain by doing so. The trust was untouchable, the will was ironclad, and Daniel was no longer the bridge between us. For the first time in years, I could sit in my own kitchen without feeling like someone was measuring the walls for when I was gone. But I also knew this wasn't quite the end. People like Emily don't fade out quietly. There's always one last act. The last act came faster than I thought it would. It was late October when Victor called me. She's contesting the trust, he said flatly. Or trying to, at least. Her lawyer sent a letter claiming you created it under undue influence from Daniel and that it unfairly excludes her as his spouse. I almost laughed. Daniel didn't even know about the trust until after it was done. I know, Victor replied. And the paperwork is airtight. But this tells us something important. She's desperate. Desperate was putting it mildly. The letter was full of bluster and vague threats with no real legal standing. Victor sent back a short, polite response, attaching the clauses that made her claim impossible. That was the end of it on paper, at least. 2 weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. "You're a bitter, selfish old woman. Enjoy dying alone." I didn't respond. Deleting it felt better than keeping it as proof. Daniel came over not long after. She's trying to get sympathy from people, he said, telling them you've ruined her life, that you turned me against her. And are they believing it? I asked. He shook his head. Not the ones who know me or you. November was quiet. Too quiet. Then right after Thanksgiving, I found out from Nancy that Emily had been asking around about whether I still kept valuables in the house. She was subtle, Nancy said, but she wanted to know if you'd sold anything recently or, I don't know, maybe moved things around. That sealed it for me. I made one more trip to the safety deposit box, moving a few last keepsakes I'd left at home, photo albums, Michael's old leather jacket, even the quilt my mother made. Not because they had monetary value, but because they were mine. In early December, Daniel told me the divorce paperwork was nearly finalized. We're not fighting over much, he said. Mostly just the house and some debts. She's keeping the house, but the debt's hers too. That told me everything. She wasn't walking away with anything of his, no accounts, no investments, nothing tied to my name. The night he told me, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I'd won, this was never about winning, but because the walls I'd built had held. Every door she'd tried to pry open had stayed shut. Christmas was small that year. Just me, Daniel and Claire. No tension, no guarded words, no feeling that someone was watching what I had instead of who I was. We ate roast chicken, laughed over old stories, and exchanged modest gifts. Daniel didn't bring her up once. I didn't either. Some things don't need to be revisited when they're already buried. Still, I caught him looking around the living room at one point, his eyes lingering on the grandfather clock, the china cabinet, the photos on the wall. I realized then that he wasn't just looking, he was remembering. Maybe even seeing the house as mine again, not as something to be claimed or managed. When they signed the divorce papers in January, he called me on the way home. "It's done," he said. And that was the moment I knew I'd finally gotten my peace back. Not just from her, but from the years of being quietly measured, prodded, and tested. There was only one thing left to do: decide what the rest of my life would look like now that I didn't have to guard every corner of it. Peace, I learned, isn't the loud relief you think it will be. It's quiet, subtle, like the way the house sounded in the mornings now, just the tick of the clock and the hum of the fridge, not the phantom footsteps of worry pacing in my head. Daniel came by more often after the divorce was final. Not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. He'd bring groceries sometimes, or a book he thought I'd like. We didn't talk much about Emily. When her name came up, it was in passing, like mentioning bad weather that had already blown through. I kept the trust as it was, though I told Victor to add one last note: if Daniel ever remarried, the same protections would remain in place. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I'd learned trust without safeguards was just wishful thinking. Claire came for a weekend in February. We drank tea at the kitchen table and talked about the quilt I'd kept in the safety deposit box. "You're going to outlive all of us, Aunt Margaret," she joked. "Better make sure I'm still in the will." "You are," I told her. And I meant it. Emily, from what I heard, had moved out of the house she kept after the divorce. Couldn't afford it. Word was she'd tried another business venture, but it hadn't lasted long. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that, just distance. She was a closed chapter. Spring brought small changes. I started planting in the garden again, really planting, not just maintaining. I bought a new chair for the porch. I even took a weekend trip with Claire to a little coastal town, something I hadn't done in years. One afternoon, Daniel sat with me on that porch sipping iced tea. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For not seeing it sooner. For letting it get that far. For you having to protect yourself from your own family." I shook my head. "Daniel, you don't need to carry that. Everyone learns in their own time. And I'm just glad you learned before it cost you more than it already did." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you hate her?" "No," I said, and it was true. I don't have the energy to hate anyone anymore. I have boundaries, and those are enough. That night after he left, I sat alone in the living room. The same room where Emily had once stood assessing what she thought would be hers. I looked around not to measure or guard, but simply to appreciate. The clock still ticked. The quilt was folded neatly on the couch. My hands were steady. My future was mine. If there was a legacy in all this, it wasn't the trust or the will or the safety deposit box. It was the knowledge that you can protect yourself without losing yourself, that you can set boundaries without becoming bitter, that saying no when it's right is its own form of love, love for the life you've built and the people who truly respect it. I never spoke to Emily again, and I didn't need to. She'd already taken her shot, and I'd already answered it without ever raising my voice. In the end, she left with nothing that mattered, and I was left with everything that did.